Greetings, this is Bonafide. The Eastern Africa is on the verge of a full-scale war. Egypt is at odds with Ethiopia over River Nile, and Somalia is at odds with Ethiopia over the signing of the treaty with Somaliland. And this takes us back to May 7th, 1929. The River Nile also provides critical amenities to all Egyptians, but this is not seen in the same light in Ethiopia. And in January of 2024, Ethiopia made a deal with Somaliland to have sea access. Now that angered Mogadishu. When the Egyptian planes were landing in Mogadishu, one diplomat opined that Somalia was playing with fire. Ethiopia felt as if it has been provoked, and that is the reason why the alliance between Egypt and Somalia has angered Ethiopia, because it is a case of an enemy of my enemy is my friend. Greetings, this is Bonafide. The Eastern Africa is on the verge of a full-scale war. Egypt is at odds with Ethiopia over River Nile, and Somalia is at odds with Ethiopia over the signing of the treaty with Somaliland. Well, with the changes in missions in Somalia, there is bound to be some change. From AMISOM, the African Union mission in Somalia, to ATMIS, the African Union transition mission in Somalia, to now the new AUSOM, the African Union support and stabilization mission in Somalia. With Egypt entering the scene, things about to change. Well, to have a better understanding of what is happening in the Horn of Africa, we have to separate the issues that are happening between Egypt and Ethiopia and what is happening between Ethiopia and Somalia. So let us start with what is happening between Egypt and Ethiopia. And this takes us back to May 7th, 1929, when there was an agreement between Egypt and Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. And this agreement included that Egypt and Sudan utilize 48 and 4 billion cubic meters of the Nile flow per year, respectively. That the flow of the Nile during January 20th to July 15th, that is the dry season, will be reserved for Egypt. That Egypt reserves the right to monitor the Nile flow in the upstream countries, as well as Egypt assumes the right to undertake the Nile River related projects without consent of upper riparian states, and that Egypt assumes the right to veto any construction projects that will affect her interests adversely. So these are the agreements that Egypt signed in 1929 that will later be amended or improved in 1959. And these are the specific quotes that Egypt is quoting when it comes to what is happening right now with Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is the cradle of the Blue Nile. If you understand how the Nile is formed, you know that there is the Blue Nile and the White Nile. The Blue Nile starts from Lake Tana in the highlands of Ethiopia, all the way, turning a U-turn, all the way to Egypt and flows to the Mediterranean Sea. But they meet the White Nile at Sudan. Now, the White Nile starts from Lake Victoria and the Great Lakes in Eastern Africa. So the two, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, encompass the Nile that flows all through Egypt, giving a life to basically the entire Egyptian economy and the entire Egyptian life as we know it. Well, the Nile is the lifeline to Egypt. It not only gives them drinking water, the Nile is the source of food because most Egyptians are farmers. Most young Egyptians, for that matter, are farmers because there is high unemployment in Egypt. And these young people have gone to their farms to get a source of income. So the Nile provides a source of income to the livelihoods of many Egyptians. Mind you, 95% of Egyptians live along the River Nile. That means that the River Nile has defined even the settlement patterns in Egypt, that everyone wants to live close to the River Nile because the large expansive land in Egypt is a desert. So the River Nile has provided a lot of amenities for Egypt that Egyptians see it impossible for them to have a reduced water level in the Nile because, as a matter of fact, the Aswan High Dam that supplies electricity to many Egyptians is built just along the River Nile. And that means that the River Nile also provides critical amenities to all Egyptians. And that is why it is very important for Egyptians or for the government of Egypt to protect the River Nile as per the 1929 and the 1959 treaties. But this is not seen in the same light in Ethiopia. Ethiopia, as earlier said, is the cradle of the Blue Nile. They have the reserve of the Blue Nile from Lake Tana and the highlands of Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia, this River Nile passes through a different kind of a terrain that makes it lucrative for hydroelectric power because of the rapids and the terrain. And so Ethiopia took it upon itself to start the construction of the largest dam in the country and in the African continent. They called it the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GAD. And in its view, Ethiopia was doing something that it could have done long time ago to give its nationals access to electricity as well as supply electricity outside Ethiopia to export it in other countries so that it can earn the Ethiopian government a lot of revenue as well as to give opportunity for many Ethiopians to upscale their incomes through electricity and make electricity cheaper for the nation and people who are going to be serviced by the power. However, this was not taken lightly by Egypt. In one way, Egypt did not have a contention with Ethiopia going ahead to construct the dam. The only contention that came in between was the timelines that Ethiopia would use to fill up the reservoir. Well, Ethiopia wanted to fill up the reservoir in between 5 and 7 years. Egypt proposed that this reservoir could be filled well within 11 to 20 years. That means a wait of 2 decades so that you can fill a reservoir that is going to supply electricity to Ethiopia and also export for national revenue. And that did not sit well with Ethiopia because, as it is usual, any government would like to succeed and commit to its people and make its promises alive to the living generation and the people who elected the government so that it can be seen as a government that is working. So Ethiopia gave its intention that it needs to fill the reservoir in 7 years. So what does that mean? It means that a lot of water will be used from the Blue Nile, from Lake Tana, to fill the reservoir in a span of 7 years. That will mean that a lot of water will be missing from the Blue Nile. And by the way, the Blue Nile supplies the River Nile with 59% of the water. The remaining 41% comes from the White Nile. So you get the reason as to why Egypt was opposed to Ethiopia using a bulk of the Blue Nile to fill the reservoir in 5 to 7 years. They wanted small bits or small amounts to be filling the reservoir as they continue using the water downstream in Egypt. But as Ethiopia will not agree to that, in 2020, as they finished building the GAD, they started filling up the reservoir with the water that was there during the monsoon winds when there was a lot of rain in the region. Well, after saying that, the international community, of course, reacted. Well, the US was the first to respond as it withdrew $100 million worth of investments in Ethiopia because of the decision, the solo decision to move a bulk amount of water of the Blue Nile to its reservoir. Well, Ethiopia did not consult any other country to go ahead and start filling up the dam. So that was a provocation in one way to Egypt, as Egypt depends on the River Nile. This happened a year later in 2021, as well as in 2022 during the high monsoon rainy season. And that meant that Egypt will be affected in terms of water levels, in terms of the levels of water that will be needed in the Aswan High Dam to support the electricity supply in Egypt. Fortunately, during the 3 years when Ethiopia started filling the dam, the monsoon winds were to the favor of Egypt, and Egypt equally received high amounts of rain that did not lead to failure or subsequent reduction of water levels in the River Nile and did not affect Egypt in any way. However, the bone of contention is that Ethiopia might go ahead and fill the reservoir during the time that they feel will be right, and perhaps at that time Egypt could be undergoing a severe drought. And during that time, there will be a problem because a reduction in the water levels will drastically affect Egypt during a drought in the country. Well, diplomatic efforts have been given a chance from time to time as the US, the UN, and the African Union have taken part in mediation between the two countries to come to some sort of an agreement on how to go about this. But there has been no kind of a positive response from Ethiopia, as during the monsoon period during the year, Ethiopia has chosen unilaterally to continue filling up the gard, regardless of Egypt's concern about the Nile and the importance of the Nile in Egypt's sustainability. Now, this next part is quite easy to understand. It is the row between Ethiopia and Somalia. But for this, we have to introduce Somaliland. Somaliland is a self-governing region in Somalia that has enjoyed practically autonomy for more than 30 years. So, quite frankly, Somaliland has everything that a country will have. The only thing that it doesn't have is recognition from the United Nations. So, Ethiopia went and made a deal with Somaliland to access the port. You know, just after the war with Eritrea, Ethiopia was rendered a landlocked country. That means that Ethiopia does not have sea access. It has tried for quite some time to have a better sea access through Djibouti, but it seems as if there will be a fairer deal, there will be a better sea access through Somaliland. And in January of 2024, Ethiopia made a deal with Somaliland to have sea access. Now that angered Mogadishu because in Somalia's eyes, Somaliland is still part of Somalia. And that means that Ethiopia went ahead to make a deal with an enemy of Mogadishu. And that made Somalia to be very, very furious, and they took the matter to the highest level. Turkey has tried for quite some time to mediate between Ethiopia and Somalia, but all the efforts by Turkey have been rendered also futile. And that is the reason why the alliance between Egypt and Somalia has angered Ethiopia so much, because it is a case of an enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that is why when the Egyptian plane landed in Mogadishu with weapons and ammunition, Ethiopia felt as if it has been provoked and that it is in the brink of a war, because about 10,000 Ethiopian troops are in Somalia to keep and maintain peace. And now, through AUSOM, those 10,000 to 15,000 troops that are in Somalia who are Ethiopians have to be taken back to the country, and that gap will be filled by Egypt. And that means that Egypt will be sharing a border with Ethiopia. Well, with all that being laid out, it is important to note that the threat of a direct war between Ethiopia and Egypt is quite low at the moment. What will happen is there is the high probability that there can be a proxy war between these two nations. And that, unfortunately, will happen in Somalia. Well, there have been different statements regarding Somalia being at the center of this issue. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia said that Ethiopia has worked to promote peace and security for Somalia and the region, including discussions to resolve differences with its neighbor. Instead of pursuing these efforts for peace, the government of Somalia is colluding with external actors aiming to destabilize the region. Egypt, through its president El-Sisi, said that in Egypt you have friends and brothers you can depend on. Egypt will not allow anyone to threaten Somalia or compromise its security. And when the Egyptian planes were landing in Mogadishu, one diplomat opined that Somalia was playing with fire. Well, the war of words have started going out, and these countries are looking towards their interests. Perhaps one major issue that they should consider is that Somalia is not yet back on its feet. The people in Somalia are still languishing in poverty. Many people in Somalia still need that strong government to work for them. This is not the time for Somalia to enter into such a brawl that can devastate the country further and send it into ruins. It is important for Somalia to look forward and try and find amicable ways to solve the issue with Ethiopia and make sure that the territory has peace so that its people can improve in terms of the economy and prosperity.